right here, right now. In 3, 2.
How you doing, everybody? Welcome to Friday Questions. My name's Luke.
My name's Mark.
And these are the questions. So, this past week, talking about marriage a lot. And so we have...
I kind of feel like at this point, one of us should say, marriage.
We are gathered here today.
That blessed arrangement. A dream within... Okay.
Hold your loved ones.
So treasure your love.
Okay.
For all you Princess Bride fans.
Yes.
If you aren't...
You should watch it, then you'll be a Princess Bride fan.
Or go back and start from the beginning and fast forward a minute and a half, and boom, we're into it. Go.
All right, so we got two questions. One, I guess only one of them is tangentially married related. The other one's not at all. Our first question is, why do I sometimes feel unloved by God?
I can see how this maybe is coming out of the Hosea series a little bit, in that, in fact, we've talked about perhaps in a future Friday Questions this idea of God and his discipline on Israel, and perhaps is that something where it's easy for us to perhaps think at times, does God really love me, or things are happening? So yeah, I can see maybe that's how this question was generated.
So I guess let's start with, what is something, because feeling unloved, that is a vague term. So I guess we would first let's define a couple ways of why you might feel unloved.
Sure.
So if you were married, like if they were ignoring you, or if they threw plates at you, or I don't know. There would be like you would have specific reasons why you feel unloved. So why would you feel unloved by God? I guess maybe one would be you're going through hard times, and
if circumstances in life are not going the way you'd want them to, for a lot of people, they could project that onto, why isn't God perhaps either removing these bad life circumstances or improving them in some way? So you wonder if that's a little bit of a hangover from works-based salvation, in that if my life isn't going well, it may mean that I've done something to anger God, or he's frustrated or mad at me, or maybe he just is fed up with me and doesn't love me. Yeah, sure. Another
one I thought of is, I've heard this phrase, if you really love someone... Well, I've heard this phrase from somebody who was having problems in their relationship. They said, if you really love someone, it wouldn't be this hard. So I guess that's my second thinking of why someone might feel unloved by God. One, circumstances aren't what you think they should be. Two, what did I just say? It shouldn't be this hard.
I thought at first you were going to say, if you love someone, set them free. But that's a different topic altogether.
And I feel like
why is it so much work?
Why is it so much work? Yeah, like, shouldn't I just feel this love from God?
Right. Isn't it interesting how, I think this is a fairly common human phenomenon. I think we all have done this and maybe even do this on occasion. It's interesting how we will easily transfer whatever's happening in our life, whether it's circumstances, good or bad, relationship experiences, good or bad, we will always transfer those onto our relationship with God.
Even people who aren't saved.
Exactly.
They will. You hear that all the time. Like, if God loved me, why would this have happened? If God loved me, why does my life suck so much? If God loved me, which I will say this, that may not be the reason that you are feeling that way, but I feel like that's probably the most common.
Right. As our life experiences and relationships and circumstances go, that can often dictate how we feel our relationship with God goes.
Yeah.
So that if I even know a few people throughout my life who they had a very, very horrible relationship with their earthly father. And so comprehending God as Father was very difficult for them. And they often, if there was discussions of God as our Father, to them, their earthly experience with their dad was transposed onto God, and so they thought, well, then he's going to leave. He's going to leave when everything, when everything is given. He's going to leave, or he's going to abandon me, or he only loves me if I'm doing what he asks me to, and those kinds of things. Or if if you're going through some horrible life circumstances, well, then is God punishing me, or has he forgotten about me? Does he not really love me? Why doesn't he clear these things up? So it's the mature follower of Jesus would recognize that what we're probably supposed to do is take the relationship we have with God that is described quite vividly by the biblical authors, and then see where human life experiences and relationships fail. But instead what we tend to do is we tend to take what's happening here and then project it to God.
Yeah.
And so in some cases, and we're not going to sweep under the rug anybody's life experiences or situations they have, but when one is following Jesus a little more closely, I think just from the get-go, we could say, hey, perhaps we need to do a better job of investigating and understanding what God has said about his relationship with us.
Yeah.
And let that be the driving force to see how earthly relationships and circumstances fail often instead of going the other way around. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I have found myself doing that at times. When I think incorrectly of God, it's often because I'm letting life dictate him instead of letting him reflect and show just how life isn't like it's supposed to be.
Yeah. Well, those were the two things that stood out to me as why someone would feel unloved: circumstances, or the other thing that I said that it should be easier.
Like if it's really love, it would just kind of it's
work.
movie love.
Yeah,
it would just flow naturally, and not recognizing that love has many more levels than just easiness.
Yeah,
to it. Sure.
So what do you think? Is there something else besides those two that pop out to you? Of why? Because first I want to identify why we feel that way. It's always good, especially like in relationships. Here's your spot of relationship advice. It's a new segment, relationships with Mark and
Luke gives relationship advice. We need like a stinger or a little theme or something. Right? Work on that, Nathan. Work on that. Thank you.
Well, I just forgot my advice.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm so excited about the new segment that I forgot what the advice actually was.
You had relationship advice to give, life relationship advice in how we sometimes don't feel loved by God.
I got it.
I knew if I talked long enough.
So we have this vague sense so many times in our relationship, and before you sit down and argue with your spouse about it, stop and say, why am I feeling this way? Like, one, what triggered it? Mm-hmm. Or what made it worse? Why did it suddenly spring up? And a lot of times you'll find like, oh, something they did triggered a memory or a feeling from when I was younger, or from this other thing, or I'm really upset about this other thing, and when you talk to me about this completely unrelated thing, I suddenly found an outlet for all my frustration that I was feeling over here, and it's you. You are the outlet for my frustration.
Right. The argument isn't over you didn't take the trash out.
Yeah.
It's probably over something else.
Yeah.
Not even related to that person, perhaps.
Yeah.
That's now been transferred onto you didn't take the trash out.
Yeah. That was our new segment, relationship advice with Mark and Luke. So all that to say, I wanted to identify okay, why would somebody get to the point where they say, I feel unloved by God? So circumstances, it should be easier. Is there anything else that I'm missing here?
Either you're not fully understanding who God is as a person, or you're not fully understanding who you are as a person, or you're not fully understanding the reality of how life relationships go when they're not directly tied to when you do good or when good things happen because God loves you, when bad things happen because God doesn't love you.
Yeah.
That can be true of a lot of human relationships, but that's not true of God's relationship. And maybe that's also the root of it, is that God's relationship to us is so unique, different, and not really experienced on this earth.
It's not a direct correlation.
It's hard to wrap our brains around it because everything else seems to be counterintuitive to that. But
right.
I think you've hit the big ones as far as the reasons behind it.
Yeah. All right, so let's tackle them. The first one, my circumstances are bad. And I guess you might not go directly to God doesn't love me. Maybe it's like, what did I do wrong? Maybe it's like,
Or where is he?
or where is he?
He seems to be distant,
But
uninterested.
if I feel like if that went on long enough, it would eventually lead to maybe not that crisp of an idea of God doesn't love me, but probably ends up like, where is God?
Sure.
So, okay, so my circumstances are bad. Why does that not mean God doesn't love me? Two negatives make a positive.
Primarily because just love in its essence and nature is not dictated by circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
Love in its truest form is a commitment, a covenant. These are all fresh in my mind. I was just telling Luke right before we started recording, I was finishing putting together some details for a wedding ceremony I'm going to officiate a couple weeks from now. And just thinking about that passage where a husband and a wife in Ephesians 5 is an example of Christ's love for the church. And there's a covenant there. There's a promise, a commitment that within a wedding ceremony is, if you're doing it right, you're highlighting the fact that this isn't just for the emotional aspect of quote-unquote love you're feeling now, but it's for the highs and the lows. It's the good and the bad, better and worse, etc. Because that's how God views his relationship with us, that there is nothing that separates or severs it. I love the last couple verses in Romans 8. If you were around for our Roman series, which chances are you were, because it was a really long series.
If you were at church at all this year.
Yeah, the 19 years that we did Romans here lately, the last couple verses of Romans 8 is where Paul just reminds us that there is not a single thing that exists that can separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus. So circumstances are really an indication of the broken world we live in, with broken people, with unresolved situations, that again, the future hope and promise that they will be resolved one day by Jesus in eternity. But if I remember that nothing separates me from God's love, and that's how God views us, and that's how his love is described to us, then the circumstances don't get twisted and tangled with his love. They are a separate thing that never, ever influences his love for us. And hopefully it wouldn't influence my love for him. That there's a maturity in recognizing, even as Paul says in Philippians, that he's learned to be content in whatever circumstance he's in.
Yeah.
And as he wrote that, he was sitting in jail in Rome. So that part of it also, that's a little side story, is if you ever really get just bombarded by your circumstances, pop back into the scriptures and read some of the stories. Let's just take Hosea, who we're on right now, for example. I was talking with Pastor Jace early this morning, and we were laughing about the fact that why didn't Hosea, I could just almost hear Hosea saying, hey, God, how about if I get to do some of the other object lessons that the other prophets did? Like, why can't I shave my head and throw the hair towards the priests? Or why can't I just, why does my whole life, my whole marriage have to be an example? And so, again, you see the circumstances of people who were the people of God, and not that they brought the circumstances on themselves. They were victims of circumstances. And it helps you remember this concept that they are part of living in a fallen world that have no bearing whatsoever. They don't move the needle on God's love for us at all. That is constant and strong the whole time.
And we did do a question, probably, why do bad things happen?
We did. I feel like we've talked about that at some point.
Yeah. Just go back and watch all of our previous.
Every single one. We've almost been doing it for a year now.
You'll find it in there probably.
Someone needs to catalog those.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Nathan can do it.
We've given Nathan a lot of jobs today. It's been good.
Plus, I feel like too, we don't know why we're going through something all the time.
Right.
Like, I feel like the most common example brought of that is probably like Joseph, but I also think about David in that sense. Like, David was a shepherd initially, and he talks about, I fought a lion and a bear while I was herding my sheep. I mean, is David sitting out here thinking like, I am the most unlucky shepherd ever First a lion comes, then a bear comes, and
I need to find a new area to keep my sheep.
right? I could have moved to a better part of shepherding town. Um, but it's like he didn't just go right to Goliath. God brought him through these other things first and built up to this. And I was thinking about that, like, if we run away from the first hard thing, then, God could very well be building us up to something that's coming. And if we run away from the easy thing, then once the hard thing comes, we haven't taken that time to prepare and build ourselves up. And then when the hard thing comes, I remember Pastor Ray talking about putting on the full armor of God, and he was saying how if you wait for battle to put on the armor of God, you're too late. It's like it's a daily thing that you're putting this on, that you're reading the Word, that you're praying, that you're doing all this stuff. So when the battle comes, it's like, okay, I'm ready.
Yeah, a helpful question is not why, God, are you doing this, or why are you letting this happen, God, but what do you want me to learn?
Yeah, what are you
through
preparing me
this?
for?
Yeah, what are you preparing me for? That can be very helpful. And again, if you are leaning into the fact that the way God describes his love for us is the way God really loves us, then it is more of an opportunity to learn and grow rather than why have I been abandoned or why is this happening to me. It's hard to get there. I know in the moment it's easy to sit here when you're not in the midst of
Yeah.
life circumstances or really rough relationships to say those things. But again, the more we prepare and think about that, when those times come, maybe you're able in the midst of them to have that approach that I'm just going to like run and cling to Jesus even more so
Yeah.
than I would during easy times. And just say, okay, God, what do you want this to come out of? Story after story I've heard over the years of people who went through very, very hard times and then they were able to flip around and walk with others through similar circumstances.
Well, and I think so much of that, I remember something that Pastor Ray said a long time ago, it was a couple of years. He was talking about sharing your faith, and he gave the example of the woman at the well and how when she went out and told people about Jesus, like she was at the well at that time because of all the husbands she had, because she was kind of a outcast of society. What did she go and tell people when she told them about Jesus? He knew everything about me.
Right.
Like he knew all of my bad things. And so it's in our redemption from the bad times. It's in how we walk through the bad times. It's in how God carried us through the bad times that we're able to be that for somebody else.
Yeah, that's good.
So, yeah, so okay, so that's one. Circumstances. So, no, God doesn't not love you if things are bad. It could just be that it's a crappy world sometimes, or it could be that God's bringing you, preparing you, getting you through something, or it could be just bad choices on your own that you've made. So second, it should be easier.
Why? Why should life be easy? That sounds cynical to ask that, but at the same time, that was never promised. That's never. Again, I go back to statements that people make often, and concepts that come out of Scripture, like this world is not our home. A lot of people lately have been talking about and even comparing it to we're exiles. We are living in a foreign land, awaiting to finally go home.
Yeah. Jesus says daily, take up your cross.
Right.
Not take up your cross, runs, and then we'll put the cruise control on and
yes, yeah.
head on into the sunset.
We'll put wheels on it and a motor, and it just goes on its own. Yeah, so I think we fall victim to the way culture describes some of these things and the way it's depicted in media and those kinds of areas where things are supposed to just happen naturally, and then there's the happily ever after syndrome. For us, happily ever after is eternity.
Yeah.
eventually down the line. But in the meantime, when Jesus told his disciples that just hard times are coming, the world's going to hate you, but I have overcome the world. So
Yeah.
that's why I sometimes wonder why we as Jesus followers can sometimes get this false sense of life is just going to be smooth and easy. Whenever people try to promote following Jesus and then all your problems go away and life just becomes amazing. Well, it does, but that's not because all your circumstances become okay. It's because you have a peace and a comfort and a hope to navigate through those things. You don't necessarily have everything just materialize into, unicorns and gumdrops and
Yeah.
everything you've ever wanted in life. That prosperity gospel, it really hurts a lot of people.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't usually happen that way. And then the challenge is, well, you don't have enough faith.
Yeah.
And so, so just, I guess if we can recalibrate our thinking toward this doesn't mean that this life will be easy, but this life will be fulfilling, even in the midst of hard times,
Yeah.
because of who we belong to and what's been promised to us.
Well, we hear Psalm 23 a lot, but Psalm 23 is, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death.
Yeah.
I'm in the valley.
Yeah.
That, there's not always a shortcut out of the valley. Sometimes you just walk through the valley, but you know that God is with you and you know that he protects you. And yeah.
Yeah.
Good. All right. So
that's
second
helpful.
question is, and some people will relate to this, some people won't. Although I have had so many teenagers say a variation of this to me when I was working or when I was volunteering in youth. But the second question we got was, like, why do I struggle with singleness? And I feel like we do have a big fear of that. Like, I've had a 16-year-old say to me, I just broke up with whoever, I'm going to be alone forever.
It's hard not to laugh at that.
Right?
Although we all said it at 16, but not to laugh at them, but just the concept of at 16 your life is essentially over.
Yeah. And we have, you said...
It's true feelings, but just in the moment you're like...
I know you said you got married at 32.
So, I was 32 when Melissa and I got married, and there were a lot of people in my life that thought that just...
What's wrong with Mark?
They begin to give you the whole, well, maybe that's what you're supposed to be single your whole life, and maybe there is, and there are some people who are called to that, and there's a lot of great theology of singleness out there that you can find, and you run to 1 Corinthians 7 where Paul lays out some very specific information about singleness and marriage and how, in his mind, singleness had some benefits that being married does not, and you can always say Paul, at least as much as we know of him in the scriptures, was not married. Jesus, of course, never married for obvious reasons. And
unless you read certain
reasons.
Books.
Right. Yeah. Fake Jesuses were married, but the real one seems not to be. And I even a good majority of Jesus' disciples, the inner sanctum of followers, male and female, it doesn't really say specifically, but it's hinted at that they also were not married.
Yeah.
And so there is, in some ways, our culture has almost made an idol out of marriage.
Sure. It's part of what we view. I mean, it's basically part of the American dream. You get married, you buy a house, you have kids, you go on vacation, life's good.
Right. And we've even commented a little bit that in some cases the general American church experience is catered towards those who go to college, get married, have kids, have a family, come back. Everything's built for the family.
Mm-hmm.
And so I sympathize with those who are single, whether they are single and hoping to get married someday or single and they're perfectly fine with their singleness, that they can on many occasions feel a little left out of the body of Christ, or they feel that things aren't really, the church isn't really built for them. And in that case, the church is the one making the mistake to gear everything towards a certain demographic for whatever reason. But instead, even you read through the New Testament and the first century church, again, we've talked about this before, it was made up of all this diversity. whether it was ethnic diversity or social diversity or gender diversity, male and female, that kind of gender diversity,
Yeah.
male and female, or within the family unit diversity, married as well as single. And so, first of all, just the recognition that singleness is not it's not a death sentence on people.
It's not a curse.
It's not a curse. It's not something that God doesn't have for you. Each individual is gifted and wired in different ways. But we would want to argue that we understand the plight of someone who feels that singleness is not where they want to be because marriage and family has been made into somewhat of an idol in our culture. That's the first thing that I was thinking of.
Yeah.
The second thing I thought of was, again, just understanding the gift of singleness. In going, 1 Corinthians 7 is the place where Paul talks about this the most densely. In that whole chapter, he begins with giving some instructions to the Corinthian Christians about marriage, but then he talks quite openly about his singleness, and he even at one point says he wishes everyone was like him.
Yeah.
Mostly because of the freedom to dedicate yourself completely to the cause of Jesus, because as a married person, you should be dedicated to the person to whom you're married. You wouldn't want to be acting like a single person as a married person. But Paul found this ability to live his life not attached to a spouse in a way that it maximized his ability to serve God.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, you'll notice that while Paul did that, it didn't mean that Paul was also in isolation. A few weeks ago, when I finished up the last chapter in Romans, we saw the family that Paul had, that there is intimacy and relationship and connectedness that can occur in the life of a single person, that they're not lacking those things because they don't have a spouse.
And I think you really got to be careful if you're like, I just want to be married so badly. Be careful that you're not putting a weight on that marriage that it is going to fail to fulfill. Like, almost like the more desperate you are to get married, the more likely you are to be disappointed by the reality of marriage. Not that marriage is bad, but that, like we talked about in the last question, it's not easy.
Right. It doesn't
takes
solve all your
work.
problems either.
Yeah.
In fact, it maximizes some of your issues, or it exposes them
Exposes
more.
them, yeah.
Like, oh, this is who you really are like. You can hide them when you're single, and then you get married, and this is an issue I have.
Yeah.
I don't think I knew that about myself. I just love that Paul calls singleness a gift.
Yeah.
Because when you think of it that way, it is something that has been gifted to you, whether it's for a period of time in your life and then you do at some point get married, or if it is something that for your adult life, if it's a gift that's been given to you. And I've seen every variation. I've known people throughout my life that have remained single their whole entire adult existence and became very content with it and used it as an advantage to do many things for God. I also have a great story of a professor of mine in college who did not get married for the first time in his life until he was well into his, I think, either 50s or 60s. And he got married for the first time. And we were pretty amazed. I felt like he was resolved to singleness, and he poured himself into his students and his ministry at his church and his writing. He was a very brilliant man. And then he meets this woman, and they get married, and they've been married for quite a while now, and there's all kinds. And so we sometimes get in the way by distinguishing marriage is acceptable and good and what you should all be desiring, and singleness is, well, at some point figure that out.
Yeah. Singleness is a problem to be solved.
Yeah, almost like, well, if neither of us are married by the time we're 40, I guess we could get married, kind of thing. I also just think that there is some amazing fulfillment and satisfaction when you realize that Jesus is the one who fulfills all the things that you need in relationship. That when we pin all that on a person, I just need to find a spouse, and then all these things will be fulfilled in my life.
Yeah.
That's not really understanding who Jesus is for you and what he can do for you. And then by a byproduct of that would be, and what the church is supposed to be for you.
Yeah.
That the church becomes your family. The church becomes the people that you live life with. And we, as a local church, need to do a better job of fostering that and creating opportunities where you feel that way. And as a single person, you don't feel like, well, I can come to big church, I can come to service, but I can't really do anything else because everything else is geared towards couples and families. So there's something to be said for finding your value and your purpose in who you are within the body of Christ, and not giving into, I only have value in meaning if I'm in some kind of relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing I would say, for those of you who are maybe, I wouldn't say younger, but if you're thinking, I someday want to be married, and you currently find yourself single, one of the great pieces of advice I ever heard on this was that right now what you should be working on the most is that you should be, it's kind of a tongue twister, but you should become the kind of person that the person you're looking for is looking for. So become the kind of person that the person that you're looking for, we're all like, I'm trying to find Mr. Everything. I'm trying to find Miss this. I've got this list of things that this future spouse of mine has to be. They have to be this tall with this colored eyes, and they have to own a Jeep Cherokee, and they have to love golden Labradors, and then they got to, all these things. And like, well, how about instead, maybe instead of trying to create a list of things that this is perfect someone for you and then looking for that person, why don't you just work on becoming the kind of person that you'd like to be married to, the kind of person they're looking for, is that when they find you, you're ready to be that person.
Yeah.
Instead of putting it all on, well, I'm just going to sit the way I am and be who I am, and I'm just going to go, I'm not going to rest until I find Mr. Right or Miss Right. Hey, just work on yourself.
Yeah, I don't need to change. They'll make me better.
Focus on becoming a much better follower of Jesus, and then see where things land. It's amazing how I've had some friends who've said, you know what, I'm just giving up dating. Forget it. I can't find anybody. I'm just gonna date Jesus. That's what they say. And so they start working on their faith, and boom, within 6 months, a year, not always, but a lot of them's like, oh, well, where did this come from? Like, well, yeah, you quit being selfish and looking out for yourself. I was part of that as well. Like my early to mid 20s, I was like, well, it's got to be this, and I got to have that, and I was kind of selfish about it. And then you kind of outgrow it, and you realize, I'm just going to try to be a Jesus follower.
Yeah.
And boom.
And once you know it,
sometimes
that is very appealing to somebody.
Sometimes, yes. Yeah. You're quite a catch that way.
It's like, whoa, you're a well-contented person who loves Jesus?
Yeah, no matter what you look like. Definitely. Yeah.
All right, good. Well, any last thoughts, parting shots?
I don't think so. I just love the idea of, and for probably, in some ways, for both the questions we just went through, is Jesus enough for you? Can you get to a point in your life where like Jesus is enough, so that whether, first question, my circumstances are bad, my relationships are rough, I don't even know if God really loves me. Like, no, I know God loves me because Jesus is enough for me. And then wherever you are in the continuum of singleness to married, and even as a married person, is Jesus still enough for you? Hopefully you're not making your spouse an idol.
Yeah.
But what a great way to kind of think through life is just that question, is Jesus enough for me? And hopefully the answer is yes. And in that way, the other things don't seem to be as important. They kind of slide to the side.
I feel like you got to be real careful. It's like that really old skit. I think it was from SNL, and it was Steve Martin. That's how you know it's old, because it was when Steve Martin was on SNL. He's like, if I only had one wish in the world, it would just be that, was it peace or something about children? It was either something that all children would be loved, or it was peace in the world. He's like, but if I had two wishes. And then as he started adding wishes, they got more and more elaborate, until he's like, you know, that first wish, just forget all about that. If I had this, I feel like that's how we can get with our, you know, does God love me, or happy with our singleness. It's like, if I just had one wish, it would just be to love God. But if I had two wishes, it would be to love God and have a nice house. Yeah. Oh, and have no problems. And have a loving wife who just makes me happy no matter what. Oh, and it's like,
they tend to drive towards selfishness.
Forgot about you, Jesus.
The deeper you go into them, yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. That's a good analogy.
Yeah, so, all right. Well, send in your questions. We will see you next week. Have a good one.
Have a good week.
Bye.